June 1st, 1945. The war in Europe is already over. Hitler is dead. Berlin is rubble. The Nazi flag has been pulled down and replaced with occupation banners. So you would expect guns to be quiet. They were not. Because on that morning, in a gravel quarry in the German city of Brunswick, American soldiers lined up in formation, rifles raised, aimed at a prisoner tied to a wooden post. A priest stood beside him. The condemned prisoner was calm.
Thin.
Nervous, yes, but not screaming, not fighting. And here is the detail that stopped reporters cold. He was 16 years old. His name was Heinz Petry. And in just a few seconds, the United States Army, the army that had just defeated Nazi Germany, would execute him by firing squad. Before we go further, subscribe to History vs. Event and click the notifications bell icon, because World War II didn't just produce battles, it produced decisions that still spark arguments 80 years later. To understand how a teenager ended up in front of American rifles, you have to rewind to the world he grew up in, and it was not a normal childhood. Heinz Petry was born December 31st, 1928, in Eastern Germany, which means he didn't grow up in a democracy, a republic, or even a politically confusing country. He grew up inside a system. By the time he learned to read, Hitler's face was everywhere: stamps, classrooms, newspapers, radios, schoolbooks. The Nazi regime didn't just rule Germany, it raised Germany. And children were the priority. The regime understood something terrifyingly simple: adults can doubt. Children absorb. So, the Nazis built a pipeline. First the Jungvolk for younger boys, then the Hitler Youth for teenagers, and finally elite institutions, the Adolf Hitler schools, designed to create future leaders of the Reich. Think less school, more military academy mixed with political boot camp. Petry was selected for one of them. Students there didn't just learn math and geography. They learned ideology, obedience, and absolute loyalty. Sports were encouraged not for fun, but for toughness. History lessons were rewritten. Biology was twisted into racial theory. You weren't being educated. You were being programmed. And to a 15-year-old, it didn't feel evil. It felt heroic. Then 1945 arrived and reality smashed into propaganda like a tank through a glass storefront. Germany was losing. Fast. Cities were flattened by bombing. Refugees flooded roads. Soldiers marched west to surrender to Americans rather than east to Soviets. Even loyal citizens knew the Reich was collapsing. But inside the Nazi leadership, surrender was unacceptable. So Heinrich Himmler approved something desperate: a secret guerrilla resistance movement called the Werewolf. Yes, spelled like a werewolf. And unfortunately, the name was about as realistic as the plan. The idea was simple. When Allied troops occupied Germany, hidden fighters would assassinate officials, sabotage supply lines, and terrorize the occupiers. A permanent underground insurgency. The problem? Germany no longer had trained soldiers to spare. So they recruited teenagers. Hitler Youth members. Students. Boys who had never seen real combat but had heard speeches about sacrifice since kindergarten. Heinz Petry volunteered. He wasn't alone. A 17-year-old named Joseph Schaefer joined him. They received rush training: pistols, rifles, explosives, barely weeks of preparation. Not commandos. Not spies. Kids handed a mission far beyond their understanding. Their orders were to slip behind American lines and gather intelligence, troop numbers, positions, equipment. Classic espionage. But they made one critical mistake. They wore civilian clothes. Under the laws of war, a captured soldier in uniform is a prisoner of war. A captured spy in civilian clothing is not. On February 22, 1945, American troops found them hiding in a ditch near U.S. positions. They were carrying notes about American activity. The interrogation did not take long. They confessed. And suddenly the U.S. Army had a problem. Because the werewolf movement had just assassinated a German mayor cooperating with Allied authorities. Commanders feared insurgency. Nobody knew if Germany would stabilize or turn into a violent underground resistance. The Allies had just fought 6 years of total war. They were not about to allow a guerrilla campaign to start on day one of occupation. So the Americans decided to send a message. A military tribunal tried Petry and Schaefer for espionage. The verdict: guilty. The sentence: death. Now here is where history becomes uncomfortable. These were not SS officers, not camp guards, not war criminals. They were teenagers raised inside a dictatorship and used by it. They appealed. Clemency was requested. The war was already ending. Germany surrendered in May 1945. But the appeals were rejected by the commander of the U.S. Ninth Army, General William Simpson.
Why?
Deterrence. The Allies believed a public execution would crush the werewolf myth before it began, a clear warning that sabotage would bring immediate consequences. And so the date was set, June 1, 1945. Hours before his death, Heinz wrote a letter to his parents. He said he hoped they would not feel shame. He believed he had served his homeland honorably. Read that again. A child raised in propaganda still thought he was defending his country, even as that country no longer existed. Morning came. The prisoners were taken to a quarry outside Brunswick. Cameras were present. Photographers documented everything, intentionally. This was psychological warfare after the war. The priest approached Heinz for final confession. He spoke quietly. Witnesses said he remained composed. He was blindfolded and tied to a post. The firing squad raised rifles. At the command, shots rang out. 16-year-old Heinz Petry died instantly. Joseph Schaefer was executed next. Then 4 other captured spies. The message was unmistakable. The war was over, and resistance would not be tolerated. But the reaction was immediate and divided. Some Allied soldiers supported it. They had seen concentration camps, death marches, and destroyed cities. To them, the werewolf threat was real and needed crushing fast. Others were disturbed. Reporters questioned whether executing indoctrinated minors crossed a moral line. Critics argued the boys were victims of Nazi conditioning rather than independent actors. And that debate never really ended. Because this story sits in a gray zone, the place history rarely likes to stay. Legally, under wartime rules, the Americans were within their rights. Spies in civilian clothing could be executed. Morally, that depends on where you stand. Were they enemy agents conducting espionage? Or children manipulated by a collapsing regime? The werewolf movement, ironically, never became the massive insurgency feared by Allied commanders. Aside from scattered incidents, it faded quickly. Germany did not turn into a guerrilla battlefield, which raises the haunting question historians still ask. Did the executions prevent a resistance, or were they unnecessary? Today, Heinz Petry and Joseph Schaefer are buried in Germany. Their story rarely appears in textbooks, but it remains one of the most controversial final chapters of World War II. Because the last shots of the European war were not fired in a battlefield charge. They were fired at a wooden post, at teenagers who grew up inside propaganda strong enough to make them walk toward rifles, believing they were heroes. History isn't always clean victories and clear villains. Sometimes it's adults fighting a war and children paying the final bill. Thanks for watching.